Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first metamorphosis of we're in 2022, right? It's all a blur. But anyway, welcome. Today, our speaker is Chantal Noa Forbes. Chantal is a cultural ecologist whose academic interests explore the impact of multi-species ontology on relationships to land and place. Chantal is a current PhD graduate in philosophy of religion from the California Institute of Integral Studies, with a concentration in ecology, spirituality, and religion. She's also the co-founder of the Religion and Ecology educational nonprofit, the Deep Water Initiative. Chantal's graduate research explored indigenous and decolonial approaches to environmental engagement, focusing on the ontological ambiguity of human-animal relationships in hunter-gatherer cosmology in Southern Africa. Chantal has organized and presented at numerous academic conferences in North America on various topics, including human-animal relations, religion and ecology, world ecology, other ways of being, decolonial methods and studies, and the primal and indigenous perspectives on religious rites and practices. South African born and raised, Chantal's professional background is as a communications specialist and educator in various fields and spans 15 years of experience in educational media, corporate communications, and agricultural education and development. Chantal received a BA in film production from the internationally award-winning film school AFDA in South Africa and an MA in Middle Eastern history from Tel Aviv University. Chantal has worked extensively throughout Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and in 2017 relocated to the US to pursue a PhD. And just on a personal note, Chantal and I worked in the same floor together for a while at CIIS, and I always look forward to our casual conversations and check-ins, and every once in a while coming and sitting in your cubicle and just kind of chewing the fat with you. I miss you.
I miss our engagement, Stefan, a lot.
Yeah. Lovely to have you here. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan now, who's going to introduce your presentation.
Yes, thanks, Stefan. Yes, likewise, I share the same sentiment about meeting you in the halls in CIIS, and I'm excited to be able to discuss your work here tonight with you. Your talk is called Reclaiming a More Than Human Psychology, the Ecological Role of Becoming Animal in Hunter-Gatherer Cosmology. And I'm going to read the abstracts. I think it's really well written, and it's going to sort of just serve as, I think, a nice kind of basis to start from with some of the key ideas set forth. This lecture explores animistic theories on the role of transspecies ontologies, reinforcing relational human identities. Here, Chantal explores the primal metaphysics of hunter-gatherer cosmologies and their relationship to earth-based psychologies. Chantal asks how animals have informed the evolution of our consciousness through our epistemological and mythological embrace of them as kindred beings of personhood. This lecture argues that a healthy and ecologically centered human identity is strengthened rather than weakened when we embrace ontologically ambiguous and mutable ways of being in the world. So welcome, Chantal. It's great to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Jonathan. And welcome to all of you here this evening. Thank you for being here. I'd like to just send a special welcome out to Vivian Song, who is joining us from the Tibetan region in China, and who runs a religion and ecology center there for Chinese youth who are trying to connect back to Tibetan heritage. So thank you for making the time, Vivian, to be with us here this evening, and for joining us at our CIIS community. And so this evening, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore a singular or narrow aspect of my research from a methodological and theoretical perspective. So I'm going to take 20 to 30 minutes to do that. And then we're going to open the floor for discussion to see how what I've introduced to you relates to the theme of this evening's talk, as well as perhaps to your own studies. And if there are aspects of my research or other theories that I mentioned that I did not fully explore within the presentation itself, we can also talk about those. And we don't have to strictly stick to the presentation or what's presented there. I didn't want to overload anyone with too many theories and too much information. I rather wanted to present a clear string of thought that we could use then to sort of diverge into different discussions of exploration. And because some of this theory may or may not be familiar to you or may not be unfamiliar to you, I am going to use a presentation for the first 20 to 30 minutes, just so that you can sort of read along with my voice and sort of ensure that you're hearing correctly what I'm saying. And so I'm going to share the presentation, and to start, what I'd like everyone to do actually is to close your eyes. I'm going to read 3 short story pieces. And the idea of these short story pieces is really to help us transition into another mindset or into a different way of thinking about ourselves in relationship to the world around us. And then once I've read these 3 short story pieces, I'll sort of indicate to you that we're completing this little meditative practice, and I'll launch into the presentation. All things, that is, living creatures, were once people. We who are Bushmen were once springbucks, and the mantis shot us, and we really cried like a little child. Then the mantis said, we should become a person, become people, because we really cried. Long ago, they were all sitting around talking. They talked and discussed things, and they said, today we're going to num ka num, create num. Then we'll write the name of all the animals on their hides. Today we'll num ka num, and we'll use it to give a different design to each animal. From today, people will no longer be people, but will have markings and be animals. So they created num. They gave names to all the animals. They told each animal his name. Julich insisted that animals were people of a sort, not humans, but people, because they too lived and thought. They asserted that each species of animal had its own distinctive physical forms, customs, habits, and ways of experiencing and interacting with the world. For them, empathy with animals was not a question of focusing on an animal's human-like characteristics, but on assuming the whole perspective of the animal. To empathize with an animal, you couldn't think like a human and project your thoughts and emotions onto it. Rather, you had to adopt the animal's perspective. And so anyone who did close their eyes can open their eyes at that point. Those first 3 little short pieces that I read were sort of mythology, oral tradition, stories, folklore that have been documented from 19th century San Bushmen that have been used for over 150 years now in San anthropology and San ethnography. And the aspect of those stories that I really wanted to point out before we launch into our discussion here is this aspect that focusing on an animal's characteristics was not about placing human-like characteristics on the animal, but about assuming the whole perspective of the animal. And so how do we assume the whole perspective of other beings and of other ways of being? That is one of the central questions of today's discussion. And so I'm going to say something outright, which would or would not be controversial in certain circles, to say that in order to achieve that perspective, in order to achieve a more than human psychology, we need to integrate the material world, the mythological world, and the ritual world. And this talk sort of makes the statement, not from my own opinion, but off the basis that this particular hunter-gatherer society and culture integrated very successfully with their environment until fairly recently by integrating these three aspects of their lives, not as separate realms or as individual units, but as a integrated whole, aspects that were continually interacting with one another. So the academic arena that we're going to be exploring this evening is one that draws from theories of anthropology and theories of indigenous studies. And we're going to explore the metaphysics of multi-species psychology. Now, there are many, many ways to explore the metaphysics of multi-species psychology. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to do so quite narrowly through animism studies and through the study of relational ontology. So this lecture explores animistic theories on the role of transspecies or multi-species ontologies and how they play a role in reinforcing relational human identities. The lecture argues that animals have actually informed the evolution of human consciousness through our epistemological and mythological embrace of them as kindred beings of personness. So this is not to dispute the large amount of research that has already been done on how the material evolution of human consciousness has been driven by its material survival within the natural world. This presentation is simply saying that it is not only our desire to survive materially that has been a contributing factor to the evolution of our consciousness, but it is equally our epistemological understanding of our relationship to the world around us and our mythological embrace that has also informed the way that we think and move through the world today. The presentation or this lecture also argues that a healthy and ecologically centered human identity can actually be strengthened when we embrace ontological mutability. So when we embrace an environment that breaks down the boundaries between us and other species. And that is really hard for contemporary society to understand outside of science fiction, outside of the realm of literature, novels, film. But if we go back and we study indigenous cosmology and mythology, and if we specifically go even further back and study hunter-gatherer cosmology, and in this case, particularly in Africa and Southern Africa, we see a way in which to engage. in this breaking down of ontological boundaries. And then lastly, we're going to look at the distinctive nature of a particular type of animism called San animism, and the way it privileges ontological ambiguity in all facets of life. So this discussion emerges out of my own dissertation research, and my dissertation was called The Primal Metaphysics of Becoming Animal During the Chasing Hunt. My dissertation defense is available on YouTube, and my dissertation is freely available on ProQuest as well for anyone who would like to view it. And I go through a large amount of comparative theory and scholarship in order to explore the process of becoming animal during a particular type of hunting in San Bushman culture in Southern Africa. And I'm not going to cover all of that tonight because first it just takes too long, and it's also combining too many threads of theory to hold a concise discussion in one evening. But what I will say is that in this dissertation, I use the theories of anthropologist Matthias Günther and his definition of San animism, as well as the theories of anthropologists and therapists Bradford and Hilary Keeley, and their understanding of Gregory Bateson's recursive frame analysis to apply Deleuze-Guattari and Arvind Sharma's theories to the process of becoming animal. And once we've gone through the presentation, if there's anything you'd like to ask about these ancillary theories of Deleuze-Guattari and Arvind Sharma, please feel free to do so. So when I refer to hunter-gatherer cosmology, I'm not assuming that the animism of the San Bushmen, which is a grouping of First Peoples or indigenous peoples to Southern Africa that are broadly referred to as San or Khoisan or Bushman or San Bushman, depending which school of thought you've come from, depending also on your sensitivities to the historical use of these different names. So I'm not assuming that their cosmology can be applied to all hunter-gatherer cosmologies. And at the same time, I do want to say that there is a lot of studies that are being done right now to illustrate that there is a great amount of shared cosmological symbolic value between different types of hunter-gatherer groups in Africa, at least. Particularly as it relates to puberty rites, as it relates to trance, song, dance, instrumental use, and as it relates to the symbolic value of specific animals, specifically the animals that have historically been most important for their sustenance. So, for example, the antelope called the eland, which also happens to be historically the most symbolic animal in their mythology and within their spiritual practice. And this is just a map to illustrate to you some of the San groupings of people that I dealt with in my dissertation. So they stretch fairly broadly from South Africa all the way to Angola. Some of these groupings are officially extinct groupings of people, like the Kam in South Africa. They became extinct as early as the early 1900s. And the most broadly studied of these groupings of people are the ones in Botswana and Namibia, who by and large were able to live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle way into the 20th century and some even into the 21st century. Some of the other hunter-gatherer groups that scholars are studying, like the Hadza, can be found in East Africa, particularly in Tanzania, sort of around this area. Yeah. All right, so I'll start off by dealing with the theories from Indigenous studies, just to give you a definition of what we're talking about. My experience within CIIS is that because we're a school of interdisciplinary studies, we use a lot of terms that oftentimes get used across the board amongst and within different departments, but they don't always mean the same thing within those particular departments. I think it's really important just to ensure that we have a base understanding of what these terms mean. So the main theory that I work with from Indigenous studies is relational ontology, which can be defined as a philosophical position that what distinguishes subject from subject and subject from object, or object from object, is mutual relation rather than substance. So that's I think, a really nice broad definition that allows you to discuss anything from, from kinship to multi-species relations to gender relations. So that's the basic definition of relational ontology that I'll be using here. More specifically, within an African context, I work with the scholar Begel Chiliza, who is a Botswanan scholar, and she explains that African approaches to epistemology are characterized by an understanding of interconnectedness, the relationship and interdependence captured in the concept Ubuntu, which recognizes that individual identity is possible only in community with others and nature. I am because you are. Without a relationship to the other and without reference to the other, the individual cannot be. And so I just, like you to meditate on that statement for a moment within the context of a hunter-gatherer existence. So we live lives that are seemingly very independent, although we're more interdependent than we like to realize. And of course, we've all come to realize this so much more through this time period in COVID. But I think one of the easiest ways to think about this type of interdependence is by thinking about a very real, tangible, and literal existence where your entire existence is dependent on the way you engage with relationships in the natural world around you, whether that's your ability to track, your ability to understand the plant species, what's medicine, what's poison, how to engage with animals, how to hunt animals in order to feed your community, and how to maintain cohesive bands of community in order to survive and exist through changing climate and changing environments over time. So the second set of theories that I'm sort of introducing here is just for us to go through theories of animism. And this is another set of theories that I feel that is mostly poorly understood. And I think that animism also means very different things depending on whether you're using the word animism within the context of environmental humanities or whether you're using the word within the context of anthropology. Having said this, animism is a theoretical term that was born out of anthropology, and so I think it's important to understand it from this context. So animism as a term was first used in the late 1800s, and it was the attribution of a soul or essence to natural phenomena. And I think that by and large, for most of us, even in fields like spiritual ecology or in East-West psychology or in religious philosophy, we're still dealing with this question of the attribution of a soul or essence to natural phenomena. And one of the reasons why we're still doing that is partly due to the large amount of damage that was done with misconceptions of how to use this theory of animism. So once this idea of attributing a soul or essence to natural phenomena was introduced into a post-Enlightenment world, where there were already quite a lot of dogmatic understandings of who had soul and who did not. So for example, Francis Bacon's understanding that animals don't have souls, women barely have souls, certain classifications of humans of different races don't have souls. So then you introduce a theory of attributing a soul or essence to natural phenomena, when you then also apply the fact that a soul doesn't apply to other natural phenomena like nature, then those that also don't have souls become sort of likened to nature. And this is where we eventually get the concept of the noble savage, a human living in nature who, like nature, is soulless and doesn't have a consciousness. And of course, the irony of this is that even standard anthropology and archaeology is now coming to realize more and more and more that it was exactly that very human that most likely had the greatest capacity for experiencing soul through a consciousness that was very attuned with its environment versus the human that exists today. And so animism evolved very slowly during this century, and one of the most famous early proponents of exploring animism is Irving Hallowell in his study of Ojibwa ontology, and he has some classic texts that you can read. And he was really the first person to switch the conversation to question the role of, to question animism as a question of the role of ecological awareness on ontological personhood. And that applies to both humans and other than humans. And he did this by working with Native Americans on this continent. And it wasn't until, and we had a lot of other scholars also working with different hunter-gatherer communities in Southern Africa, in South America, and in Northern Europe, exploring these basic understandings of animism. In the 1990s, we evolved into what we now know today as new animism. Which is a really exciting and developing field, which marks what anthropologists call the ontological turn, or an anthropology beyond the human. So this is an anthropology which really looks at questions of personhood without assuming that a person need be a human. And I'll go into that a little bit further. Two of the strongest sort of scholars in this field is Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveros de Castro. And they're always referred to because they hold two very different perspectives within animism that really inform the field. And then we have the second generation of new animists that work with relational ontology, and Tim Ingold and Ron Vilislav are two good examples of that school. So if we dive a little bit more deeply into new animism tries to retrieve and revise old paradigms of the traditional animism, and it also brings in philosophical perspectivism, and it does rely quite heavily on continental philosophy. It's not always so evident when you look at the work of some of the animists, but then when you go and study their theories, some of the animists subscribe to the post-structuralist school of French philosophers. Some animists subscribe to the phenomenological school of Heidegger. So there's a strong philosophical bent behind this new animism. It's not merely an animism that comes out of a traditional anthropology. And so what are the main proponents of these two main streams of animism? And the first, by Descola, states that the aspect of human, non-human continuity by virtue of a shared interior spirit or soul. So both these scholars worked within South America with hunter-gatherer tribes there. And so Descola really studied how these hunter-gatherer communities understood the shared interior of spirit or soul between beings within Amazonia. Viveros de Castro focused on the understanding of discontinuity through different exterior bodies. So you can see how in some ways they can be seen to be talking about the same thing. One talking about shared interiority, another talking about a discontinuity of exteriority, so that we clearly have different exteriors between species and between beings. And he focused on how that informs animistic relations, whereas Descola focused on how shared interior informed animistic relations. Both of these draw really heavily from the structuralist anthropological school of thought. And paradoxically, at the same time, they also draw from some post-structuralist scholars like Deleuze and Guattari in some of their theories. So yeah, I think this is partly why animism is sometimes not always well understood. What is important to note is that these particular scholars really only study hunter-gatherer culture within an Amazonian context. So they're only dealing with a certain part of the world. The next generation, as I mentioned, scholars of animistic relational ontology really deal more with the phenomenological lineage of Heidegger, as well as with a variety of philosophical theories from process relational ontology. And these scholars, they deal with a broader sort of cultural group and setting. Vilislav, for example, deals with shamanic North European cultures. So we do have a broadening of cultural context. None of these scholars focus on hunter-gatherer cultures in Africa, by the way, which is quite strange given the anthropological significance of hunter-gatherer peoples in Africa, even though in all of these scholars' books, there's usually a small chapter that is mentioning the hunter-gatherers of Southern Africa. And most anthropologists that work in Southern Africa find these highly insufficient, which is eventually how the theory of San animism came about. So the important thing to sort of note about animistic relational ontology is that whilst drawing from phenomenology and also drawing from some very fundamental indigenous ideas of relational ontology in terms of your relationship to the materiality around you, this animism is very materially based. It's very environmentally based, and it's concretely placed within what Ingold calls the dwelt-in world. And it places the significance or importance of the dwelt-in world above conceptual, symbolic, or even the semiotic world. And it definitely does not deal with the mythological world as it relates to the question of shared personhood and shared ontology. And so animistic relational ontology asserts that a creative force permeates all existence, but it privileges biologically material relations over mystical, mythical ones. And so their theories are really helpful, as you can imagine, for environmental humanities. They're really helpful within an ecological context. But theirs, as well as the original new animist theories, are really lacking in one's ability to deal with the place of ritual and mythology in questions of shared ontology between species. And with that point, I just wanted to say I haven't, we can't make assumptions. I'm not sure if that's the case because those scholars simply didn't pay attention to that type of scholarship, or they might have had a bias to that type of exploration. But somehow anthropologists who studied San anthropology somehow always took a lot more cognizance of the mythological aspects of San cosmology and the ritualized aspects of San cosmology, which has allowed for a San animism to develop, which I think allows for a more holistic approach to transspecies ontology. So San anthropologist Matthias Günther recently published a double volume which explores human-animal relations by really analyzing the field of animism, looking at the way that animism has developed, looking at the way that these scholars have studied animal-human relations, and then comparing these animistic studies to his own understanding of San ontology and what is the difference between San animism and the animism that other scholars have put forward. So Günther, initially when he wrote this volume, he said he wrote it because he found there to be a complete lack of treatment or discussion of hunter-gatherer cultures in Southern Africa within the world of animism. And so at the same time, new animism really has renewed an interest with many scholars in different disciplines trying to study symbolic culture amongst indigenous hunting societies. So I think this is a developing field of study across multiple disciplines. Okay, so what exactly is the difference between San animism and the animisms that we've just discussed? So let me go back. San animism is distinguished from other animisms through its emphasis on the recursive process of ontological mutability or transformation that occurs between what Günther defines as three domains of being. differences amongst interpretations of animistic relational ontologies really arise in the classifications of where ontological continuity exists and how this continuity expresses itself in the material world, in the dwelt-in world. That's what anthropologists are interested in. That's what ecological scientists are interested in. It's what a lot of people are interested in, even people in religious studies. So Gunther defines 3 domains of being that exist within San cosmology, and he defines them as the here and now. So that would be Ingold's dwelt-in world. Then he defines the domain of the liminal world of ritual. And then there is the domain of the world beyond, of mythological time and being. And he takes a long time to explain how these 3 domains of being interplay with one another on an ongoing basis, to the extent that all 3 exist within Ingold's dwelt-in world at the same time. But he does this by going through different ritual acts and by going through examples of human, animal, how could I put it, expression. So whether this be through mimesis, or whether this be through costume, or whether this be through hunting, which is something that I then took and further explored, or whether this be through the trance dance, or the puberty rites of a woman or a male. He looks at these specific ritualized activities and how the here and now and the world of mythological time and beings interplay with each other through that space of ritual. And then he also looks at how in their cosmology, how certain sort of, I wouldn't call them gods, but it's the only word that I could think to use in the English vocabulary, how gods or spirits or beings or realms from outside of our dwelt-in world interject in some ways almost randomly from one domain into another domain. And it's their sort of, what Gunther and many others also argue is that it's their value of this recursive process of one thing becoming another, of transformation taking place between one realm and another, which is also ontological in kind, that really informs the basis for their cosmology and informs their outlook on their world and their engagement with their environment and other beings. So San animism does not embrace the perspective approach of emphasizing a discontinuous exterior, nor a continuous interior. Neither does it relegate ontological continuity to a selection of domains or realms between the earthly and otherworldly. In this respect, it's less focused on personhood and more focused on how the interaction of persons occurs in the fluidity between different realms of being. So if you think back now just for a moment to the story that I read at the beginning, where the song storyteller says, in the beginning, all things were persons, all living creatures. Not all persons exist in the here and now, in the dwelt-in world, and persons existing in different realms have different ontological status, but it's the interaction of those persons between ritual, mythology, and the here and now that informs their animism and their outlook on the world, which is in some ways, it includes all the other aspects of the prior animisms, but it's quite revolutionary and unique. Not that it's revolutionary in the sense that we just discovered it now. It's revolutionary from a theoretical perspective in our understanding of hunter-gatherer psychology and perspectives on the world. So Sugawara, which is a Japanese scholar that works a lot as well with San anthropology, he explains that in contrast to Ingold's view, San ontology refuses the presumption that a uniform plane of nature covers all of the earth, admitting that multiple natures exist, each of which strictly coincide with an indigenous ontology. And we can go into that a little more. So in San animism, cosmology, mythology, and ritual are all purposeful punctuations of the dwelt-in world. They're meant to engage in the dwelt-in world, allowing for multiple planes of existence to coexist, which is, I think, something that's quite challenging for us to wrap our minds around. And I think unless you're really engaged in reading the stories and language and folklore of these people, it's hard to really understand to what extent they really see this as a reality. Less so now, since they no longer live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but it still exists within the folklore and the mythology. Okay, and so this, I'm just bringing the story that I put from the beginning again in here to introduce the last sort of two concepts that I'm going to introduce before we move into discussion, is that something unique again to San animism is the idea of primal time and the idea of a first and second creation. And so the story is really talking to primal time and first and second creation. So primal time is a time that still exists. We don't live in primal time any longer. It still exists in another realm, but it's a realm where there is complete mutability and fluidity between ontology of beings. And there's a lot of mythology about primal time where animals become gods, gods become humans, humans then become animals, who become gods, who become animal gods, humans. And so there's a lot of stories which are not random. There's a lot of moral value and epistemology embedded in these stories. But these stories still exist to this day, of the way that creatures are constantly mutating and transforming in primal time. And this was the state of all beings in first creation. So as Han Kosi says at the beginning, in the beginning, all things were persons, which I find to be quite interesting. It's not all things were animals, it's all things were persons, and then they became eventually humans and animals. Which is a really interesting psychology. So we have a value of personhood to all beings, to all creatures from the start. Second creation is the dwelt-in world, the here and now that we sort of exist in today, where I usually say this is the world where naming occurred, as is mentioned in this story, and that naming gave a concrete definition to the ontology of beings. And Matthias Günther always likes to remind me that is presumably so. That's second creation is concretized, so we think. From the outset, we think that this ontological definition has been brought into the world, but as San mythology constantly reminds us, that first creation continually comes and punctuates itself into second creation, and and humans become lions, and people who are hunting become the animals they hunt. And there's a whole interplay again between beings that takes place, which really appears to be geared towards maintaining a certain order of relational ontology between species, and a type of reverence for the role of each species within an environment and an existence. So when Gunther talks about his 3 domains of being, these domains of being, the here and now and the mythological world, you can see the mythological world as being primal time or first creation, the here and now as being second, and ritual sort of acts as a foil to interplay between these 2 worlds, or to have these 2 worlds interplay with one another. And different anthropologists describe this interaction in very different ways. I really liked what Gunther did with the 3 domains of being. And then on top of that, I really liked what Keeney and Keeney did when they applied recursive frame analysis to the recursive process of moving between second and first creation during acts of ritual. So they used recursive frame analysis to study story and puberty rites within San culture, and developed a theory of how the mythology assists with an ontological process of moving between first creation and second creation. And of course, it's hard to understand this without giving you examples. I explore this in depth with regards to hunting, but one example is in the puberty rites of a woman, where before she becomes a woman, or at the time that she first starts to bleed to become a woman, she removes herself from the community and engages in a number of rituals where she metaphysically, and sometimes not so metaphorically, takes on the identity of an eland herself, and moves into a space psychologically of first creation where she's vulnerable to be the hunted. And she experiences, in a sense, a mini death, and then re-emerges out back into second creation as a woman, and actually becomes renamed. So you can understand how these processes start to fit together. And I think one of the things that a lot of San anthropologists try to impress upon is that these are not just mere psychological exercises. These are things that are somatically felt for those that are experiencing them, which informs a much more somatically engaged psychology, what I would call a more than human psychology, because they are taking on, as was mentioned in one of the earlier slides by Megan Beasley, they are taking on the whole animal perspective by engaging in this ritual. They are not only engaging in a process of mimesis, which is done from time to time, they are actually taking on ontology. And in many instances, there's a phenomena that takes place, for example, with a hunter, called tappings, where the hunter feels the animal in very specific ways. It sometimes feels as if hair is growing on the back of the hunter's neck, or feels the blood from the animal, or feels various aspects of the animal. And for them, this is a very real phenomenological experience. It's not just a psychological experience. So San Bushman religion and ceremonial life are shown to highlight the importance of experiences that enact the way changing forms are given primacy over any subsequent naming or indication that stills movement. So they value the fluency of being in the world. Bushmen value experience that constantly shapeshifts in a unique phenomenological domain that ceremonial performance aims to access. And so Kini and Kini are sort of indicating a number of things here. First, they're indicating or reinforcing what I've already said, is that one of the primary epistemological values of San cosmology and mythology and ritual acts is changing forms of being, is ensuring that nothing remains static, nothing remains stationary. We are always engaging in an ontologically fluid world of moving relations. And then they're also stating that this is the primary importance or function of ceremonial acts within that community and society. And so lastly, I'll emphasize this once more in the way that Gunther defines hunting, for example, where he says that hunting is not merely a practical emergence of relations that arise from the phenomenological experience of dwelling in the world, but it is also infused with the mythomagical. Such relations and encounters are for the San also preternatural, mystical, and mythical, both real and surreal, deriving not only from the hands-on, lived-in world, but also from the liminal and otherworldly domains of ritual and myth. And so in sort of closing for this part of the presentation, I just want us to meditate on some of these concepts here. So I'm premising the San animism as one form of hunter-gatherer psychology. And so just to bring us back into the dwelt-in world and to remind us that this is already a society and community that have been proven to be masters of their physical environment. They are the most studied hunter-gatherer community in the world from a material biological perspective. And, you know, in the 70s were termed the original scientists for the deep knowledge and understanding that they have of the natural world. They're also masters of relational psychology. The more you read their mythology and folklore, the more you understand how they understand how things work in relationship to one another, both material and mystical. And, you know, I think it's important to remind ourselves that hunter-gatherers are the most successful, both physical and psychologically successful societies that have existed until the colonial era. They sustained their form of existence for tens of thousands of years, where we can be said to barely have managed to sustain our current existence for 10,000 or 10,000 period of years. And in that time, we've changed drastically, and you know, in some opinions, we've evolved to greater heights, and in others, we've devolved in some ways, you know, to the point where we're on the verge of potentially making ourselves extinct on the planet. There's a new era in hunter-gatherer studies, and I just mentioned three scholars here, Chris Lowe, T.S. Garnis, and Camilla Powers, who strongly believe that in order to reclaim the value of hunter-gatherer psychology, that we need to move beyond studying their mere material value, or we need to move between studying their knowledge for its mere material value, and that we need to glean more from their cosmology and mythology to understand how those can potentially inform our current moment. And this is part, I think, of an evolving new era in animism studies. And so what I've sort of presented here to you today, in a sense, only introduces the case that in order to adopt an other than human psychology, it is not enough for us to know our environment scientifically or materially. We need to engage with our environment from a space of stories, from a space of mythology, from a space of ritual relations. We need to embrace multiple domains of being in the world, and we need to allow the tangible and the non-tangible to speak to us and interact with us. So that sort of concludes the initial presentation part of this evening's talk. And we can explore what I've said, and you can sort of ask questions about that, or you can ask me questions about how some of the other theories fit into this. So yeah, I'll open it up.
Thanks, Chantal. Fantastic. There's a lot in there that we could get into. I think we can start with some people in the audience. Some questions or comments.
Well, I'm going to venture in.
For sure, Scott.
I'm so happy I have attended this lecture, Chantal, and so it's just a little bit of my own, and this is why I say venture in, because a little bit of my background is from Jungian psychology and from the ideas of that he puts forth around spirit, the polarities, and I feel like that's a very Western and even more Christian idea of the reality of the world, that there's these polarities. And one of the things that I've always had a difficult time with is the world of polarities, and I've always thought of that there's a third. And one of the things that I'm working on right now is that my argument is that the third, at least in the Western ontology, the Christian Western ontology, is the heart. And that's the place where, the spirit world and the material world can interplay. So what's really fascinating to me is this hunter-gatherer notion, and that Gunther's positing of three distinct realms that are very fluid, and so this is, I'm fascinated. I know this is a comment, really. I don't know that I have a question, but it's just I'm so happy that there is this perspective that's different, that's there. And it's just that I hadn't explored it. I hadn't gone deep enough yet to explore it. And so I'm really happy that I was able to attend this today.
Great, thank you, Scott. And I just want to add on that point, one of the things that I did in my research is I did draw on the philosophy of process relational ontology. And one of the reasons I did that is because I feel that there is a genuine effort within the school of process relational ontology to reclaim a less polaristic and dualistic European tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing this in different ways, and sometimes they're doing this by working with new sciences. Like a lot of scholars who are doing this through the language of complexity theory and complexity sciences, because it's a very demonstrative language to use to illustrate these points from a theoretical basis. So I would encourage you to sort of delve into that as well, in an attempt to sort of reclaim something from the European lineage that might have not have been highlighted in the way it should have at all times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I've also had some very personal mystical experiences with you know, doing a shamanic journey with the Celtic in the Celtic tradition of Samhain, where you know, Samhain is the in-between world, the world of ancestors. It's like Halloween. It's like the Mexican November 1st, when ancestors can, the veil slips, and so there's a mixture of the two realms. But what was intriguing to me in my shamanic journeying is that I always had animals and I always had plants that would show up, as opposed to other people would have individuals. They would have persons that would show up. And so I'm really intrigued with this relationship. I mean, I came away thinking my ancestors are trees. My ancestors are the red rose. My ancestors are, you know, the coyote that was, and the owl that was following me or were guiding me. You know, I mean, this is how I've come away from that. That is like this world that, I mean, I don't know, I'm not going to put it into the world of animism, but it certainly has a, I mean, if I were to explore a little bit more, it might end up there.
Yeah. Use that as a starting point to explore. I think that's using your own experience as a starting point. It is a great way to begin to inform your research. I would really encourage you to do that, because you'll find an authentic way to get to where you need to be.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Maybe I could jump in and ask a question, which is related in the sense of kind of working beyond a kind of binary system, you know, inheriting a binary system and realizing, wait a second, how is this really just limiting me to one of two different kinds of things, you know? So I like that you brought that up, Scott. I was thinking it in terms of time, and I'm really struck by the idea of primal time. And when you were speaking about the different phases of these loops, the here and now, the mythological, liminal, the world beyond, but you were very clear to say that these are coexistent in a way. And so I think that for me, it's a breath of fresh air to get outside of that kind of the way in which I've accepted modernity and its use of time, which is really a linear sense of past and past, present, future. And so getting out of that, it also means the here and now, rethinking what is the here and now, is that it's not different than the past or the present in some kind of ontological way. It's not sectioned off as something that contains a different type of substance in a way, right?
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that's really, really, it speaks to a certain importance in overcoming, I guess, that kind of that binary of the where we've been and where are we going, and thinking it in less of a teleological way, you know. And so I bring it up also because in your abstract you talk about evolution of humans, you know, and I think this is such an important piece, because when we think about the evolution of you know, consciousness, which is a big theme in our school, you know, I think that there's a lot of different ways in which that we explore this through thinkers, different ideas and such. But it just seems to me, in terms of that mythology, that story, that we are not any, we know ourselves through a story. Epistemology is story, right? It's not some axiom that is transcendentally given. And that, I think, when you started with that, the myth about the personhood at the very beginning, everything is a person. It really speaks again to how it is important to that we are in a critical relationship to our myths that we grow up with, our containing myth, and kind of reimagine in a way. And I think that this is really, really very insightful and super helpful. I wanted to, maybe I'll let you respond if you have any thoughts on your mind.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. There's a few things I want to say. The first is that, and this is as it relates to the evolution of human consciousness, my intuitive sort of instinct tells me, I feel like even within the realm of CIIS, we're so focused on like the human's greatness in its own evolution of itself somehow, like, and the way that, if it wasn't language, it was mushrooms, or like, and I'm not putting down those theories or potentially the importance of plants, for example, because they're also as important in this discussion. But what really surprises me is that no one's ever talking about the influence that the very creatures we had to hunt to survive, like the influence they may have had on our thinking. Like these were creatures that we had to know so intimately. When you read from some anthropologists, how they can watch an animal or read an animal's tracts and then reenact for you exactly what that animal did, how it turned, what it ate, where it, sort of dropped a leaf, when it got scared, who might have frightened it, how was it killed. There's a type of what Gunther calls a sympathy bond between the animal and the human that by its very nature breaks down the boundaries. So just logically, you would assume there's a huge influence from animal to human in the evolution of our consciousness. And I don't really see this discussion coming up a lot in the discussion of the evolution of human consciousness. What I am seeing a lot more in hunter-gatherer studies is that scholars in hunter-gatherer studies are starting to demonstrate how symbolic consciousness existed a lot farther back than we assumed it did. And if that is the case, then the question is how? What was going on? Where did the symbolic consciousness emerge from? If these people had barely invented tools, and at this point we're still chasing animals down literally by running in their bare hands, and yet that somehow we're creating jewelry and passing this jewelry on across countries and half a continent. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions, which also plays into this notion of our time, our understanding of time. Then the second thing I want to say is that we also have to remember that, and this is the difficulty of having this discussion, because what do we do with this information? Anthropologists have also demonstrated, Gunther writes a chapter in his book called The Disenchantment of the Son. Sugawara, in his understanding of Son view of corporality, also talks about a belief system that still existed when he first started working with the Son that barely exists today. Now that, people have been moved off their land or living in sort of impoverished contemporary modern environments, going to school, no longer hunting or gathering. So I think we also have to realize that there's something about the magic of this way of being in psychology that is actually directly tied to us living amongst our environment. And it's what I find interesting about it is that this is not, how could I put it? Like, to put it in very crass language, that is not a woo-woo thought. These are practical people whose waking hours were concerned with survival. So ritual was not performed for the sake of ritual alone, like we do it, simply because I have nothing else to do and I'm trying to fill my time, or I'm trying to culturally stimulate myself. The mythomystical did not punctuate the dwelt-in world randomly for no purpose. There's a type of order to their cosmos which exists through a type of disorder, which is the beauty of it. But it's very practical, even when it's mytho-mystical. And what's interesting is that we don't really, because we're so well cared for with the infrastructure that we live in, we're often not very practical in our day-to-day lives, and we engage in acts of spirituality and acts of ritual or in mythology in very in ways that are not very purposeful, or in ways that are not, how could I put it? They're not necessarily even very respectful, because they don't have a specific intention behind them. So I think there's a broader discussion to be had about when we want to reclaim this type of psychology. It doesn't just mean getting together and engaging in the trance dance per se to experience ontological mutability. Like that might be one step, and maybe those experiences help you on this path. But what is the greater structure that we need to reclaim in terms of this type of psychology? And I think that talks to some of your questions as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anybody else have a question?
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me and welcome me at this session. I am very enriched and enlightened. I took a lot of notes, and because a lot of this series and names are similar, it's far from me. I'm not a Siri person, but the meanings underlining it and the ideas, I have physical reaction, because I felt very close to me, because a lot of these mythologies and human non-human relationship, is where I experienced in my work and the community that I work with. It's real. I just wanted to quickly ask whether some of your theories covers human and landscape relationships. Not animals, but landscape, because it's something I'm interested in recently, because in the Tibetan regions, all the mountains have personalities, and they have, well, that's also what informs us and shapes us. How will if you have some suggestions where or how could I look into the human and landscape relationships? Thank you.
So thank you, Vivian. Jonathan, I don't know if you have the reference or panned, if you could maybe just put Craig's Terrapsychology book in the chat group. We have a professor in this department, Vivian, that teaches on a new field called terrapsychology, which really deals with the way that we explore our relationship to different earth beings through an exploration of of either the psychology of the earth being itself, or the psychology of the or our psychological reaction to the earth being. So there's an interplay that goes on there. And so that book would be quite helpful. And then there is another book by a scholar in South America. Her name is Marisol de la Cadena, and I'm just going to put her name there. And I think it's called, I'll send it to you. It's basically about mountain beings in South America, in Andalusian culture. And from what you're sharing with me, it sounds very similar to what you're sharing from the Tibetan region. And she actually does an ethnography on these mountains as personalities, and really explores the relationship of her indigenous culture to physical spaces. The San Bushmen do have that relationship to spaces. I did not explore it as much because I felt that other scholars were doing that, and I wanted to focus more on the animal aspect. Although I have come across anthropologists who spent a lot of time going to look for sacred places in San mythology, and then really studied like the bigger identity that those places had. And what was often found in the San case is that those places were identified with a particular ritual, and then also a particular animal. And in many cases, that ritual was a rain dance. So there was an environmental, functional purpose to the personality of the sacred space. A lot of that knowledge is less known because that one group that I referred to, the Kham, which were wiped out in the early 1900s, these were rituals that were quite specific to them. And so this is the first of the San Bushman groups to go extinct in Southern Africa. And although we have a large amount of folklore from them, no one was really able to speak to them directly, to engage them in dialogue of some of these issues.
You know, I'm also reminded of Hawaiian mythology or cosmology, that where the volcanoes all have personalities, Pele, you know, that are associated with gods and goddesses. And you know, I don't know any of the literature or anything like that, but that might also be a way of moving into this subject.
Thank you.
I have a question along these lines, Chantal, in terms of, I guess we could call it methodological, in the sense of, you know, you made it clear we're moving out of a kind of a logocentric humanism, right? Like human is at the center of everything. And even you were talking about the school, the way in which we are thinking about evolution and such. And so in terms of thinking, you know, more horizontally, right? Animism, new animism, that's one of the ways in which it's kind of like it's critiquing this verticality of like the transcendent and the human being able to leap out of, you know, nature or the body and such like that. And so that's this relationship between the immanent and the transcendent, I find is a very important reconsideration of ontology in general, right? So I'm thinking in terms of the more traversal kind, and we're interacting, we're entering into, we're thinking about, and we're seeing in other, you know, indigenous cultures, the San people, how they can they have an ability to become more liminal, or, you know, in the Deleuzian language, find that zone of proximity, right, in becoming animal. So there's a porousness. And so this kind of in this relation with the other, you know, being porous, being open, finding the space between, allowing it to speak more. And I guess my question is that there's ethics here as well, in terms of how we could engage in this, because there's still a tendency to, or there can be a tendency to personify as if your self is the center, and you're really opening to another force, but you're not displacing like a self-centrism in a way, which I'm hearing in what you're describing as these types of ontologies is really, it's not about that necessarily, or maybe you can clarify, but I just like to talk a little bit about that, because, you know, I think personification is a very powerful tool, you know, and I know, Scott, you're really into Hillman. James Hillman comes to mind. I read his book, and he was somebody that brought animism back into some popularity, I guess, too. But I just was always trying to figure out that fine balance between that self-other relationship and how to really displace the fact of that I am going to give you, let's say if we are all persons, right? Like animals have personhood, but is it a granting of personhood? Because that would be the same as granting somebody as human or not human, right? And so in this type of an ontology, I'm just wondering how something would get the status of a person, because there's going to be things in their ontology that maybe don't have that status too. And I do love that idea of like a mountain too. I was, you know, thinking of a person, think of a face, you know, and even a mountain face, you know, we're seeing a mountain face, we're seeing a face in the mountain, and to bring in some more Deleuzian ideas to spur on your imagination maybe, but like the faciality, the idea that the face is a kind of a signifying black hole or gravity. Things are going to start to swirl and to make sense around faces in general. And I was thinking of that in terms of a mountain face. And I guess really it's like, what's the difference between giving a face and seeing a face or receiving a face, you know? Granting that face to the mountain, or actually receiving it and seeing it. And I just want to know your thoughts on that. There's no answer to this, I think, but I think, you know,
I mean,
how do you approach that?
It's a very interesting question, because I think that these ideas are being presented from an existing cosmology, right, that has a really deep-seated epistemology that is based on story, as you mentioned. So you can't just adopt the principle without the structure of a mythology, cosmology, or even an understanding of what your own epistemology is. So this is the problem that we are actually sitting in. So we need to recognize that other people have seen the world in different ways and are still seeing the world in different ways. So that's step one. And then we need to think about how do we, in our postmodern constructs, move towards a different way of thinking. And it's not necessarily as simple as an adoption of these ways of being. And so on the one hand, I don't have an answer. On the other hand, I'm looking at where a lot of new anthropologists, which really are like undefined in terms of space and discipline and arena. Some of them they're also engaged with environmental scientists. These are people that are, in a sense, taking the question of personhood out of the picture to start with, in order to engage in this discussion. So Anat Singh is one such anthropologist, and she just co-edited a volume called The Art of Living on a Damaged Planet. And the scholars that engage with her in her schools of thought draw heavily on Deleuze, amongst others, And by taking the question of personhood out of the picture, and then you ask, well, where do you go by taking the question of personhood out of the picture, is you turn to other forms of nature, actually, to inform our place within an assemblage of other emergent beings. And so these scholars are, as I mentioned before, using complexity theory, complexity science, alongside, complexity theory and science wasn't necessarily called such when Deleuze and Guattari were first writing what they were writing, but essentially they were using the philosophical basis of those sciences. Now, scholars who are using those sciences now are able to perfectly apply Deleuze and Guattari's language to these environments. So they're using these scientists to study other beings that are not necessarily assumed to have personhood in indigenous ontology, even though they may. So, bees, ants, creatures that swarm, creatures that work in mass groups of collection that do not exist outside of the whole, so that don't actually have identity outside of the swarm. And so they're working with ideas of the swarm, of the assemblage of being, and how the movement and engagement of that assembly of being causes reactions and creates emergent space, like on the planet. And so if you go back and you think of the Kalahari Desert, for example, instead of seeing, and I know scholars who are working with some of these theories, instead of seeing the persons, the eland, the San hunter, or focusing on that, it's more focusing on the whole ecology, the whole ecosystem that lives within that desert as an assemblage of emergent space. And so in that study, space becomes an active participant too in the picture. And we're not talking about who does or doesn't have personhood. So we're actually putting animistic theory aside for the moment, and we're using science to explore a contemporary postmodern form of relational ontology. So that is one way that I do see a lot of people studying the Anthropocene, or what you would call like Anthropocene studies.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. It seems as though, if I understand what you're saying, it seems to be thinking individuations, like rather than like things that are individuating that are not persons necessarily, and sort of branching out, and rather than privileging certain ideas of what gets to be individuated in a complex enough way that it becomes a person. You're speaking also of including so many different types of things that we can consider individuation in a Deleuzian sense. I'm sort of coming from a Deleuzian sense. You're not a Jungian sense.
Yeah, and I mean, fungi is one of the things that is really being used to demonstrate and illustrate these theories. So we're talking about things that are, what's interesting is a lot of things that, that's not the right word to use, but a lot of beings that are being used in these studies, we're not sure even sometimes whether we should be calling them plant or animal, or organism, or what they should be called. And the more we learn about them, we're not even sure how to classify them. And so there's also something quite, interesting about that.
Maybe it's teaching us to stop classifying so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's moving more along this sort of line of Deleuze's and Guattari's rhizomatic theory. So it's really exploring what does the rhizome mean within the realm of a collection of beings that are individuated but still constitute an assemblage of beings. and which essentially is us too, within a greater society. And I think in some ways that's a psychology that I've seen for many people is easier to embrace than hunter-gatherer psychology. I just so happen to like exploring the roots of ancient humans, but a lot of post-humanist scholars find it much more easy to turn to the language of science and organic assemblages.
Right, and we sort of now, for me, I'm really feeling this whole talk's really built to that idea of a non-human psychology, which you spoke about. We've gone quite long here, but I wanted to ask Stefan to maybe have the last word, unless somebody else has a burning question. The people that haven't spoken, please feel free to jump in, and I'll leave it to Stefan to close and maybe conclude the discussion with whatever is on his mind.
Anyone else? I'm gonna just jump in. Well, I wanted to thank you, Chantal. I've had the privilege of listening to you speak on a number of occasions now, including the podcast that you did with Jonathan and I. I don't know when that's going to be released, but that's also a really wonderful, when eventually it is released, people should listen to it. And I find, the subject is really, really fascinating. And I have a background, my MA is in anthropology, and I have a vested interest and a love of the subject also. I don't have much to say. I'm learning. There's a lot in your research that I don't know. So I'm just trying to take it in and absorb it. But one thing that kind of came to me while I was listening was the thought of, you were talking about in the tile that you put up that told the story that had to do with the naming of animals, because there was some a language that was interject some words in there in a language that I didn't understand. I was wondering who actually it is that's naming the animals. So before you get into that, my assumption is the first human being or the first human beings name the animals. And the thought occurred to me that, we also have that cosmology in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And the biblical cosmology is much, much more ancient than the society that actually wrote it down. And it could very well go back to the ancient African past, and it could be, 40,000-year-old, 50,000-year-old, 100,000-year-old cosmology. We don't know. But the idea that those that name the environment, that give names to things in the environment, are projecting onto that environment their values and their way of understanding that environment. And so there must be a really different structure to the environment that we recognize if we're living lives of hunter-gatherers or if we're living lives of dumpster divers in a modern urban setting. And the devaluation, which just has to happen naturally when the more removed you are from the natural environment, is going to create a sense of other beings as sort of not conscious in a way. They become the backdrop for your own, kind of observation of yourself or whatever. I don't know how to put the words, but it's like, I was talking to my partner today about the Disneyfication of the world, how, like American tourists might go, I don't want to lump them all together, but go to a country other than America, like India, and the people just become a backdrop for them, something exotic that they see through a filter. So a lot of this stuff is just kind of churning for me, like how can you understand that their understanding of the world when you are raised within a cosmology that is kind of almost hardwired into you. And that's not hardwired, but it's baked in, certainly, to the point where you can't scrape it off the pot very easily. So I don't know if there's a there, if maybe there's something that you can speak to about that. This very difficult question of understanding a cosmology that is so completely different than the one from which we're operating.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan. First, I wanted to say I really like this idea of, other persons of whatever kind becoming a backdrop. And immediately when you said that, I was thinking of wildlife parks or game reserves, where today we go into the Kruger Park and the animals are this like a backdrop to this environment, and we're sort of like, wow, look how good they look and look how interesting they look, but we have no real lived relationship to them. We barely understand 3 facts about any of these animals.
Right. And we're asking ourselves, am I having a hunter-gatherer experience?
Yeah, we're like having a hunter-gatherer experience. Meanwhile, hunter-gatherers, actually, the song talk about this process when they were moved out of areas that became the wildlife parks, and they talk about the way that the separation between themselves and the antelope, the different kinds of antelope. And one gets a sense of the psychological trauma that actually took place when they were, in a sense, separated from kin, from a type of person who was family, in their greater relational existence. So that really speaks to that point. I thought that you or someone might bring this point up about the naming. What I find interesting is that looking at this story in a hunter-gatherer cosmology can maybe help us reflect differently on our own mythological stories from our traditions, in the sense of like what's really going on when Adam names the animals in the garden, for example. And the same question that arises in this Son Bushman story of let us name the animals, who's naming, who's the us. We have the same thing, in the Torah, where God says, let us make the human. And there's a huge history of tradition and back dialogue as to who's this us, what's actually going on here. So I don't think there's an answer to that, and I don't think there's supposed to be an answer to that. But what is definite is that if you look closely at all the cultures that have a mythology of some type of naming, it's indicating a formation of the world we know. That's something that we can see that is in common between these. It's giving us a framework to engage in the world in the way that, or the way we think we understand it today. And with the Son, what's fascinating about their cosmology is they're saying we still have a way to engage with the ontological existence pre that mythology and cosmology, to engage in an ontological way of being that existed before the sort of like creation narrative, so to speak, which is really fascinating. And I think scholars like Matthias Günther, he first wrote about the trickster god in Son Cosmology, I think in the 70s, and it's taken him 50 years to really explore some of the thinking behind some of their mythology. So I think it really does. It's really hard for us to really grasp this, but I think it's important for us to try. And I think it's important for us to engage in different cultures' mythology, not to appropriate, but in order to be exposed to different perspectives and to ask ourselves how those perspectives reflect on what we think we know about the world. And I think that just even engaging in that practice will help us change our relationship to other beings, and will introduce elements of a more than human psychology to us.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's great. It's a really good place to stop. I want to thank you for coming in and speaking with us, presenting. It was really great to spend an evening with you. Jonathan, how long will when will this be posted and where?
We'll post this to the East-West Psychology YouTube channel by tomorrow. And we'll send out a link for people who aren't able to make it.
Great, and thank you very much for hosting. It's always a great pleasure to be present with both of you. And thank you, Scott and Vivian and Kristen and Charlie for joining.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Chantal. Until next time.